had planned the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp by the river, and spend a few days away from the noise of everyday life. It was something I had done before, but never alone. This time, I wanted the silence, the isolation. No distractions. Just me, the trees, and the cold air of late autumn settling over the land. The drive was long, about 3 hours from town, mostly on dirt roads that twisted deeper into the forest. The further I got, the fewer signs of civilization there were. No gas stations, no houses, no streetlights. Just endless trees lining the road, their bare branches stretching toward a gray sky. I reached the campsite just before sunset. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near the river where a few other campers had stayed before. The fire pit was still there, a few burnt logs inside it. I parked my truck near the edge of the clearing, stepped out, and stretched my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It was quiet, except for the faint rush of the river nearby. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up first, secured with heavy stakes in case the wind picked up during the night. Then I gathered firewood, stacking it near the fire pit. I had packed enough food to last me a few days. Simple meals, nothing fancy. As the last light faded from the sky, I lit a fire. The flames crackled, casting long shadows over the trees. I sat by the fire, eating my dinner, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. A bird calling, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere out there in the dark. It wasn't until much later, when the fire was dying down and I was thinking about heading into the tent, that I noticed something. A sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere past the trees at the edge of the clearing. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I stared into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering light of the fire. I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods could play tricks on you, especially when you were alone. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, watching as the flames grew brighter. If something was out there, the fire would keep it away. I stayed up for another hour listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, cold even through the padding. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, and I wasn't alone. The first thing I noticed was the sound, soft, careful movements just outside the tent. I held my breath, my body frozen. Something was there. Someone. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, but I didn't turn it on. If I made a sound, if I moved, they'd know I was awake. The sound circled the tent, slow and steady. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I strained to listen. No heavy breathing, no whispers, just those soft, deliberate steps. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. Then the zipper. It moved just an inch. Not enough to open, but enough to make a sound. I reacted instantly, kicking at the side of the tent with all my strength. There was a sudden shuffle outside, quick footsteps moving back into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the knife I always kept with me, unzipped the tent, and burst out into the cold night air. Nothing. The fire was still burning, but only dimly now, casting weak shadows over the clearing. The trees beyond were nothing but black shapes, silent and unmoving. I turned in every direction, my pulse hammering in my throat. No sign of anyone. I stood there for a long time, gripping the knife, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The only sound was the river, steady and indifferent. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, pacing the clearing, scanning the darkness for any movement. Morning came slow. The sun barely made it through the thick clouds overhead, casting a dull, gray light over the forest. I was exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up my gear. I didn't care how much time I had planned to stay. I wasn't spending another night out here. As I loaded the last of my things into the truck, I noticed something. Footprints. They were faint, but they were there, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. Not mine. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I got in my truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The road stretched endlessly through the trees, winding back toward town. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the road, watching me leave. I didn't relax until I was home, until I locked the door behind me and sat down on my couch, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. I never went camping alone again, and I never stopped wondering who was out there that night, and what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. I had always been the kind of person who preferred being out in the open, away from people, away from the noise of the city. I worked a job that kept me cooped up in a small office for too many hours a day, staring at a computer screen, dealing with numbers that never seemed to end. The only thing that kept me sane was taking time off to go camping. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the wilderness. That's why, when I finally got some vacation time, I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote spot I had found on a map. It was in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep into a forest, far from any established campgrounds. That was how I liked it. No other people around. No noise except the wind in the trees. I got there late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, mostly because the last stretch of road was just dirt and gravel, winding through the trees with barely any signs of human presence. I found a small clearing a little way off the road and set up my tent. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, just the way I liked it. As I was unpacking my gear, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe some hunters had passed through recently. Maybe someone had parked there before me. I didn't see any other cars or signs of people, so I brushed it off and got to work setting up camp. The evening was calm. I got a fire going, cooked some food, and sat there enjoying the silence. The sun dipped below the trees, and the sky turned dark. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. It was exactly what I wanted. But as the night went on, I started feeling uneasy. It was a strange kind of uneasiness, like I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear a rustling in the trees, but when I shone my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there, just darkness and silence. I told myself I was just being paranoid. When you're alone in the woods, your mind starts playing tricks on you. You start hearing things, seeing things that aren't there. I convinced myself it was just the wind, just animals moving through the brush. But something still didn't feel right. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Every time I drifted off, I would hear something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, like someone was moving nearby. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Car engine. It was distant at first, just a low rumble, but it was getting closer. Headlights cut through the trees, illuminating the darkness for a brief second before disappearing behind the trunks. Who the hell would be driving out here this late at night? I stayed completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. The vehicle stopped. The engine shut off. I could hear the sound of doors opening, then closing, and then silence. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. Whoever they were, they weren't making any noise now.
No voices, no footsteps.
Just the eerie, heavy silence of the woods. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up at dawn, the first light of the sun cutting through the trees. My body was stiff from sleeping on the ground, but I felt a little better. The fear of the night before felt distant now, like a bad dream. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. And then I saw them, footprints, dozens of them, all around my tent. Some were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt and pine needles. Others were smeared, like someone had been dragging something. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever had been here last night hadn't just passed by. They had been watching me, standing outside my tent. I looked around frantically, scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. No cars, no signs of anyone, just the tracks in the dirt. My mind was racing. Who were they? What did they want? I needed to leave, right now. I rushed to pack up my things, stuffing my gear into my backpack as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother rolling up my sleeping bag properly. I just shoved it in. My hands were shaking. Then I heard it. A voice, far off in the distance, but getting closer. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't even bother heading back to the road. I just moved, cutting through the trees, pushing through branches, running in the direction I thought my car was in. Then I saw them. 3 men. They were wearing uniforms, police uniforms, but something about them felt wrong. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another had a pistol at his hip. They weren't moving like normal officers. They weren't calling out for me to stop. They were hunting me. I ducked low, moving through the underbrush as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they would hear it. I needed to get to my car. I needed to get the hell out of here. Then suddenly a gunshot rang out. I dropped to the ground. They were shooting at me. I didn't think, I just moved, crawling, then running, keeping my head down. Branches tore at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I could hear them behind me, moving fast. Then my car. It was right there. I sprinted for it, my fingers fumbling for the keys. Another shot. The back window shattered. I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the engine, slammed my foot on the gas. Gravel flew as I sped down the dirt road, my tires barely gripping the uneven surface. In my rearview mirror, I saw them standing there watching me go. They weren't chasing me anymore. They didn't need to. They had already done this before, and they would do it again. As I reached the main road, my hands were still shaking. My breath was ragged. My body ached, but I was alive. I never went back to that spot. I never told anyone what happened, because if I did, who would believe me? They were cops, and they got away with it. I was never the kind of person to scare easily, but that night in the graveyard changed something in me. It was meant to be just another camping trip, something different, something to shake up the usual routine of hiking and setting up camp in the woods. I had done plenty of that. I wanted something more unique, something with a little edge to it. That's how I ended up in an old graveyard miles from the nearest town, deep in a rural part of the country where people still lived by old traditions and told stories about things that didn't belong in the modern world. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted a quiet night under the stars, away from people, away from the noise of everyday life. The graveyard wasn't one of those well-kept places with trimmed grass and neat rows of headstones. This one was old, neglected, forgotten. I had found it on an old map while looking for secluded spots to camp. It wasn't marked as a cemetery anymore, just a patch of land with no official designation. When I got there, I saw why. The headstones were cracked, some leaning at odd angles, others sunk so deep into the earth that only the tops of them poked out. Some were covered in moss, the names and dates long since worn away by rain and wind. The surrounding trees had grown wild, their branches stretching over the graves like bony fingers. Thick undergrowth had swallowed up many of the smaller stones. There was a narrow dirt path leading through the middle, but it was barely visible beneath the fallen leaves and years of neglect. I could tell that no one had been here in a long time. No flowers, no fresh footprints, no signs of recent visitors. I set up my tent near the edge of the graveyard, just outside the line of trees. I wasn't stupid enough to camp directly on top of the graves. Not because I was scared, but because it felt disrespectful. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, the scent of a place that had been left to time. There was no sound except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. As the sun set, the place took on a different feel. The temperature dropped quickly, faster than it should have for early autumn. The graveyard seemed to sink into the darkness, the shadows between the stones stretching long and deep. I built a small fire to keep warm, even though I knew I would have to let it die out before sleeping. The last thing I needed was to start a fire in a place like this. I sat there, eating my food, staring into the flames. The silence was thick, pressing in from all sides. Even the wind had died down, leaving the night unnervingly still. Then I heard it, faint, distant sound. It wasn't an animal, wasn't the wind shifting the leaves. It was something else, a rhythmic, deliberate noise. I held my breath and listened. Came again, closer this time. A dull, heavy thud, like something solid hitting the ground. Then another, and another. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The graveyard stretched out before me, nothing but rows of old stones and tangled weeds. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, the night too quiet. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That's what happens in places like this, when you're alone in the dark. Your brain starts filling in the silence with things that aren't really there. I forced myself to relax, finishing my meal and burying the fire before crawling into my tent. I left the flap slightly open, just enough to see outside. The moon had come up, casting long shadows over the graves. The stones looked taller in the dim light, almost like figures standing silently in the night. I lay there listening. Nothing, just the soft whisper of leaves shifting in the breeze. Then the sound came again, louder this time, closer. I held my breath, a dull, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Then another thud. I wanted to tell myself it was just a branch falling, maybe an animal moving through the brush. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded purposeful. I reached for my flashlight, but stopped myself. I didn't want to draw attention to my tent. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it knowing where I was. I stayed still, listening, waiting. The noise stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke to a sharp sound just outside my tent. A single, heavy footstep. I froze. Someone was out there, standing just feet away. I listened, heart pounding. No movement.
No breathing.
Just silence. Then, slowly, the sound of something brushing against the fabric of my tent. I had a knife with me. I gripped it tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The touch on the tent was light, almost hesitant. A slow, deliberate drag of fingers or something else, tracing along the fabric. Then it stopped. I waited, every muscle locked in place. The next sound made my blood run cold. A soft, deliberate exhale. Whoever or whatever was outside my tent was breathing, standing just inches away. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the presence outside moved away. Footsteps, slow, steady, fading into the graveyard. I didn't move. I didn't dare. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the graveyard. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The graveyard looked the same, empty, silent. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the middle of the graveyard, stopping right in front of my tent, and nothing leading away. I packed up my things and left without looking back. I had always preferred the quiet of the woods over the noise of the city. It was the only place where I could truly think, where the stress of daily life didn't press against my skull. That's why I took solo camping trips every year. This time, I had picked a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place far from any marked trail, far from the scattered campsites where weekend hikers stayed. I wanted true solitude. The drive had taken nearly 8 hours, the last 2 spent on narrow dirt roads, the kind that seemed forgotten. My truck was packed with supplies, enough food for a week, extra water, a first aid kit, and my rifle. I always brought it when camping alone, more out of habit than necessity. The biggest danger was usually a bear sniffing around for food. By the time I reached the valley where I planned to set up, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The place was perfect. Dense forest on one side, a slow-moving creek on the other, and not a soul in sight. I set up my tent quickly, started a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The night was peaceful. Owls hooted in the distance, crickets chirped in the undergrowth, and the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. That first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, made coffee over the fire, and spent the day hiking up the ridges, mapping out the terrain in my mind. No trails, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been out here in a long time. Just how I liked it. I spent the afternoon fishing in the creek, catching enough to cook for dinner. Everything felt right, but that changed on the second night. I woke up in the dark, not sure what had pulled me from my sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling, just silence. I listened, straining my ears. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, distant. It wasn't an animal. It was something moving, something heavy stepping through the underbrush. The way the twigs snapped and leaves crunched told me it wasn't a deer or a bear. Whatever it was on 2 legs. I reached for my rifle, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound faded, growing more distant, and eventually disappeared. I stayed awake for another hour, gripping my rifle, my eyes scanning the dark, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me in the middle of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. When dawn broke, I climbed out of my tent, stretching my stiff limbs. The uneasy feeling still lingered, but I tried to shake it off. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were about 30 yards from my camp, just at the edge of the trees. They weren't deep, but they were clear boot prints heading toward my campsite, then veering away. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But why wouldn't they call out, announce themselves? And why approach my camp in the middle of the night, only to walk away? I followed the tracks for a while, but they disappeared into the thick underbrush. Whoever it was, they knew how to move through the woods without leaving much behind. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. The peace I had felt was gone, replaced with paranoia. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven so far to get here. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a random passerby, someone who saw my fire and got curious. That didn't explain why they came so close without saying anything, but I was grasping for explanations. As the sun set, I made my fire bigger than usual, as if that could keep anything away. I ate quickly, barely tasting my food. The woods felt different, heavier. I climbed into my tent, keeping my rifle next to me. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up at every little sound. My nerves stretched thin. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. I held my breath, my fingers gripping the rifle. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving just outside the glow of my dying fire. Whoever it was, they were watching me. Part of me wanted to yell out, but I stayed silent. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would give me away. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the steps moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then sat up, gripping my rifle, staring out into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, throwing my gear into my truck. My whole body was tense, my nerves frayed. I felt like I was being watched. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone step out. But the woods were empty. Then, just as I was about to climb into my truck, I saw something on the ground near my fire pit. A knife, a hunting knife. It hadn't been there the night before. I stared at it, my blood running cold. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. Someone had left that knife there on purpose. I didn't waste another second. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until I was miles away from that place. I never went back to that valley. I still camp, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods. And I never ignore that feeling again, the feeling that something isn't right. Because I know now, sometimes when you're alone out there, you're not really alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a break from everything. Work had been a mess. My sleep schedule was all over the place, and I just needed some time alone. That's why I decided to go camping. No phone, no people, no distractions. Just me, my tent, and the sounds of the woods. I drove out early in the morning, heading deep into a national forest a few hours from home. It was early autumn, and the trees were starting to turn orange and yellow, but the air still had a lingering summer warmth. I had checked the forecast before leaving. It mentioned a chance of rain, but nothing too bad. I figured I could handle it. I had been camping alone plenty of times before. It wasn't a big deal to me. I had my gear packed: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food to last the weekend. My plan was simple: set up camp, cook some dinner, and just relax in the quiet of nature. The first few hours were peaceful. I found a nice spot off a dirt trail, far enough from the main camping areas that I wouldn't run into anyone. It was a small clearing with a few fallen logs and a decent amount of tree cover. I pitched my tent between two large pines, made sure everything was secure, and gathered some firewood. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant sound of birds. By late afternoon, the clouds started rolling in, dark, heavy ones. The air turned colder, and the wind picked up. I could feel the change coming. The smell of rain was in the air. I double-checked my tent, making sure it was properly staked down and waterproofed. I didn't want to wake up soaked in the middle of the night. Not long after, the rain started. Came down slow at first, soft pattering against the leaves, small drops tapping against my tent. Then it got heavier. The wind picked up, making the branches above me sway and creak. The fire I had started struggled to stay lit, hissing as raindrops hit the burning wood. Eventually, I gave up and let it die out. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself up in my sleeping bag, and listened to the storm. The rain was steady, and the wind made the trees groan, but it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I closed my eyes, trying to let the sound of the rain lull me to sleep. Then I heard something. First, I thought it was just the wind, a low, distant sound. But then I realized it was something else, something moving. It wasn't an animal. I could tell by the way it moved, slow, deliberate, like someone taking careful steps. Not the quick, darting movements of a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The sound was close, just outside my tent. The rain made it hard to hear, but I could make out the faint sound of footsteps on wet leaves. A slow, shuffling step, then another, then silence. I held my breath, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was just a branch falling. Maybe it was nothing. But then I heard it again. A step, then another, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I had my knife in my bag, just a short reach away. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound, and wrapped my fingers around the handle. My heart was pounding now, every muscle in my body tense. I waited. The rain kept falling, masking any smaller sounds. I couldn't tell if whoever or whatever was out there had moved closer or farther away. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just the sound of the storm. I forced myself to breathe, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it really was just my imagination. The wind can play tricks on your ears, especially when you're alone in the woods. Then I heard it again. But this time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Low, slow, just outside my tent. I could feel the blood drain from my face. Someone was standing there, not moving, just standing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I gripped my knife tighter, every muscle in my body on edge. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound was gone. No more breathing, no more footsteps, nothing. I stayed awake for hours, my ears straining for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the rain. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I must have drifted off at some point because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The rain had stopped, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. I slowly unzipped my tent, my heart still pounding. The ground outside was soaked, the dirt turned to mud. I scanned the area, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Then I saw them. Footprints, not animal tracks, not random marks from falling branches. Human footprints, leading up to my tent, stopping just outside the entrance, then turning and walking away. I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. The whole way back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, watching the trees, listening. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I had always enjoyed hunting. It wasn't about the thrill of the kill, but about the solitude, the connection with nature, the discipline of patience, and the challenge of tracking. I grew up hunting with my dad, and after he passed away, I carried on the tradition alone. It became a way for me to clear my head, to be out in the wild where the air smelled like pine and damp earth, where I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees. This particular trip was meant to be no different. I had planned a week-long solo hunting and camping trip deep in the mountains of Montana. It was late October, just before the heavy snows came. I preferred this time of year because the woods were quieter, and there was less competition from other hunters. Most people didn't like being that far out alone, but I did. I had been doing it for years, and I knew how to handle myself. I drove up into the mountains, leaving the last bit of civilization behind when I turned onto an unmarked dirt road. The drive was slow and rough, my truck bouncing over ruts and rocks. After about an hour, I reached the spot where I usually set up camp, a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick forest. It was a good spot, sheltered but open enough that I could keep an eye on my surroundings. I stepped out of the truck, stretched my legs, and breathed in the cold, crisp air. The sky was turning a dull gray as the sun dipped lower. I had just enough time to set up my tent and get a fire going before dark. I worked quickly, gathering firewood, pitching my tent, and preparing my rifle and gear. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal of canned food and jerky, and listened to the sounds of the woods. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. I heard the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. The wind picked up a little, sending a chill through my jacket. I stayed up for a while, staring into the fire, letting my mind wander. Then, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air was freezing, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground. I made a quick breakfast, packed my gear, and set off into the woods. I moved slowly and quietly, scanning the ground for tracks, listening for movement. After about 2 hours, I spotted a set of fresh deer tracks. They led deeper into the forest, and I followed them carefully. As I moved, the trees grew denser, the air colder. The tracks led me up a ridge, then down into a small valley where a narrow stream cut through the trees. It was a perfect spot, quiet, secluded. I crouched behind a fallen log, rifle at the ready, and waited. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, but the air remained cold. My fingers grew stiff around the rifle. Just as I was about to shift my position, I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. My heart picked up. I scanned the trees, my breath slow and steady. Then I saw it, a buck, stepping cautiously into the clearing. It was big, with a thick coat and a wide rack of antlers. It lowered its head, sniffing the air. I lined up my shot, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing through the trees. The buck stumbled, then bolted. I stood up quickly, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. The shot had been good, but the deer had run. That was normal. Sometimes even a well-placed shot wouldn't drop them immediately. I moved toward the spot where it had stood, scanning the ground. Blood, a good amount of it. I followed the trail. The tracks led deeper into the trees. I moved carefully, my rifle ready, watching for movement. The blood trail grew heavier, which meant the deer wouldn't be far. Then I found it. The buck lay still, half hidden in the brush. His body was limp, eyes glassy. I exhaled, relieved. I approached slowly, checking to make sure it was truly down. It was, but something felt off. The air was too still, the woods too quiet. I had hunted enough to know when something wasn't right. I glanced around, my fingers tightening on my rifle. Then I saw the tracks, not the deer's. Something else had been here. The prints were deep, wider than a human's, and they followed the same blood trail I had. My stomach tightened. A bear, maybe, but the tracks were odd, not quite right. The shape was different. I looked around. Nothing moved, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched next to the deer, knife in hand, moving quickly to field dress it. If a predator was nearby, I had to work fast. The woods stayed silent, too silent. Then, another sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze. The hair on my neck stood up. The sound was close, too close. I gripped my rifle, standing up slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed the deer, and started dragging it back toward camp. I moved fast, my eyes darting around. Every instinct in me screamed to hurry. Halfway back, I heard it again. The footsteps, following me. My breath came faster. My hands ached from gripping the deer's legs. I forced myself to keep moving, not to look back. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. The fire was still smoldering from the morning. I dropped the deer near the fire pit, my hands shaking. I turned rifle up, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew it was still there. I worked quickly, cutting up the deer, my knife moving fast. I kept my rifle within reach, my ears straining for any sound. Then, just beyond the firelight, movement. A shape, tall, human-shaped, but wrong. I grabbed my rifle and aimed. Nothing, just trees. But I knew it was there, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my rifle across my lap, my back to my truck. The woods were silent, but the feeling never left. By dawn, I made my decision. I wasn't staying. I packed up quickly, tossing my gear into the truck, my rifle always within reach. As I drove away, I checked the mirrors, and I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, still, watching. I pressed the gas. I never went back. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea of camping on an old farm, far from the city, felt like a break I needed. It wasn't a commercial campsite, just a stretch of land owned by an old friend of the family. He had moved out of state years ago, leaving the farm in the hands of his brother, who barely maintained it. I got permission to camp there for a few nights, and the thought of quiet evenings under the stars, away from work and stress, sounded perfect. The farm was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. The last half hour was all dirt roads, winding through fields that stretched for miles. I passed abandoned buildings, old barns with sagging roofs, and fences that had long since collapsed. The land had a forgotten feel, like time had passed it by. The main farmhouse stood at the end of a long, rutted driveway. It was a 2-story wooden structure, weathered and empty. The windows were dark, some cracked, others boarded up. I parked near it but had no plans to go inside. My campsite was set up about 100 yards from the house, near a small creek that ran along the edge of the property. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal over the fire. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the landscape turned dark. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of wind through dry grass. I sat by the fire for hours, enjoying the peace. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a dull, distant thudding, like something heavy striking wood. I sat up, listening. Came in slow, steady intervals. Thud, pause, thud. It was coming from the direction of the old barn. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe something had knocked over a loose board, and the wind was swinging it against the side of the building. But the sound was too steady for that. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I turned on my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The farm was dark except for the faint glow of dying embers from my fire. I aimed the light toward the barn. It stood about 50 yards away, its roof sagging, its doors slightly open. The thudding had stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, then finally convinced myself it was nothing. I went back inside the tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I walked over to the barn. The doors creaked as I pushed them open. The inside was a mess. Broken tools, rotting hay, rusted equipment. I searched for anything that could have made the noise but found nothing. The rest of the day was normal. I spent most of it exploring the property. There were a few collapsed sheds, an overgrown garden, and a dried-up well. The place had been abandoned for years, but it was clear someone had been here since then. I found old footprints in the dirt near the back of the house, leading toward the tree line. I told myself they were from hunters or trespassers. That night, I built a bigger fire. The memory of the sound still bothered me, and I wanted as much light as possible. Around midnight, I heard it again. Thud, thud. It was slower this time, but closer. I turned off my lantern and crouched near the fire, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the barn anymore. It was coming from the field behind my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam over the tall grass. The field stretched far into the darkness, but nothing stood out. The sound had stopped again. I waited. Nothing moved. I barely slept that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed up my tent, loaded everything into my truck, and took one last look at the farm. Something wasn't right about this place. As I was about to get in my truck, I noticed something new. Near the barn, in the dirt, were footprints. Bare feet. They hadn't been there the day before. They led from the barn toward my campsite. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the grass. I didn't stick around. I got in my truck, backed out of the driveway, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I'll never camp on an abandoned farm again. It was late summer, and the air was thick with humidity when I decided to take a camping trip with my ex-wife. We had been divorced for about 2 years at that point, and while most people would think it was strange for exes to go camping together, we had remained civil. It wasn't like we were best friends, but we had history, years spent together, a house, memories, routines. After everything, we figured we could at least be in the same space without killing each other. We both enjoyed the outdoors. That was something we had in common even when everything else between us fell apart. She had suggested the trip, saying she wanted to get away from work, and I had agreed without much thought. Maybe I just wanted an excuse to escape my own life for a few days. Maybe I wanted to remind myself of who I used to be before everything unraveled. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites that filled up with families and groups of college kids. It wasn't completely off the grid, but it was remote enough that we wouldn't see anyone unless we went looking. It was the kind of place where the silence felt heavy, where the trees swallowed sound, and where you could sit by the fire at night and feel like the last two people on Earth. We drove up in my truck, packed with supplies: tent, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, a couple of knives, and a small hatchet for chopping firewood. The drive took about 4 hours, the last hour of which was on a dirt road that was barely wide enough for my truck. The deeper we went, the more the trees pressed in, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. We worked quickly, pitching the tent, gathering firewood, making sure everything was in place before it got too dark. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire, eating the food we had packed, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, the rustling of leaves as something moved through the underbrush. Normal sounds, sounds I had heard 1,000 times before, but there was something else too. Something beneath the usual noises. I noticed it first, a faint clicking sound that seemed to come and go. It wasn't an animal sound, not one I recognized, at least. It was too deliberate, too measured. My ex-wife heard it too, but we both dismissed it. Maybe it was just a branch tapping against another in the wind. Maybe it was nothing. The second day we hiked. We followed an old trail that wound through the trees, leading to a small river about 3 miles from our campsite. The water was clear and cold, and we sat by the edge for a while, enjoying the quiet. She took off her boots and let her feet dangle in the water. I skipped a few rocks, felt almost normal, almost like before, but the feeling didn't last. On the way back, I got the sense that we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something just out of sight. There was nothing there, just trees thick and endless. But the feeling wouldn't go away. When we got back to camp, the first thing I noticed was that our tent was open. The flap we had zipped shut was halfway unzipped, hanging loose. At first, I thought maybe I had left it that way by mistake, but I knew I hadn't. I checked inside, expecting to find a raccoon or some other animal rummaging through our stuff, but everything was exactly where we had left it. Nothing was disturbed, not a single thing. That night, the sounds came back, louder this time, closer, the same rhythmic clicking, coming from different directions. First to the left of the campsite, then to the right, then behind us. I didn't say anything, but I knew my ex-wife heard it too. She kept glancing at the darkness beyond the firelight, her shoulders tense. We didn't talk about it. Maybe we didn't want to acknowledge it. Maybe saying it out loud would make it real. At some point in the night, I heard something move just outside the tent. A slow, deliberate step, then another. I held my breath, straining to hear, then silence. I didn't sleep much after that. Neither did she. By morning, we were both on edge. We decided to pack up and leave early. Something about the place felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew we needed to go. As we loaded the truck, I noticed something in the dirt near the tent. Footprints, not ours. They were barefoot, human, but the strides were strange, too long, almost unnatural. We didn't talk about it. We just got in the truck and drove. Neither of us ever mentioned that trip again. The air in the Amazon was thick, hot, and heavy with moisture. Every breath felt like I was pulling in steam. The sun barely cut through the dense canopy above, leaving us in a world of endless green. Even with all the buzzing insects and distant cries of unseen animals, the jungle had an unsettling silence to it. I was part of a small group of campers who had decided to take a trip deep into the rainforest. There were 5 of us in total: me, David, Marcus, Ryan, and Luke. We had flown into Manaus, hired a local guide, and traveled by boat for nearly a day before being dropped off miles away from any sign of civilization. The plan was simple: camp for a week, explore, and make it back with stories to tell. At first, everything was exactly how I imagined it would be. The jungle was wild and beautiful, thick vines hanging from towering trees, bright-colored birds flitting through the leaves, and the constant hum of life everywhere. But as the days passed, things started to feel off. We noticed small things at first, little details that didn't add up. Our supplies seemed to be shifting around when no one had touched them. One morning, Ryan's backpack was sitting 3 feet away from where he had left it the night before. Another time, Marcus swore he had packed an extra bottle of water, but it was just gone. We chalked it up to forgetfulness and moved on. Then we found the footprints. They were deep in the mud, half covered by fallen leaves, and clearly not from any of us. Barefoot, human, but something about them wasn't right. The toes were too long, the shape slightly unnatural. They didn't match the footprints of our guide, who had left us days ago. That night, none of us slept well. The jungle played tricks on us. The sounds of the night chirps, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch became sinister. Every noise felt closer than it should have been. By the 4th night, things escalated. We had set up camp near a river, thinking it would be a good source of water and an easy landmark to follow. As we sat by the fire, eating from our rations, Marcus froze. He was staring past the fire, eyes wide. I turned to look and saw nothing at first, just the blackness of the jungle beyond the trees. Then something moved, a shape low to the ground, just at the edge of the firelight. It was gone before I could focus on it, but my skin went cold. We decided not to say anything. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe we were just imagining things. That night, I woke up to a sound just outside my tent. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved with purpose. This was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. Soft crunching in the leaves. Then nothing. Morning came and we all knew. We weren't alone out here. We checked the area and found more footprints. This time, they were circling our tents. We needed to leave. Packing up quickly, we checked our map and compass, trying to get back to the river where we had been dropped off. It should have taken half a day at most, but the jungle played tricks on us. We walked for hours and yet nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, the paths blending together. Then we saw them, figures in the distance. At first, I thought they were just more trees, shadows playing tricks on us. But as we moved, so did they. Low to the ground, barely making a sound. They weren't running or charging, just watching. That night, we didn't sleep. The fire stayed lit, but it didn't feel like enough. We could hear them moving in the darkness, just beyond the light. A branch snapped, then another. Something was coming closer. I gripped the small knife I had and tried to slow my breathing. The jungle was too thick to see anything clearly, but I could feel it. Then, just before dawn, the noises stopped. Morning came and we ran. We ran like animals, crashing through the jungle with no regard for direction or safety. We just knew we had to get out. I don't remember how long we ran, but eventually we stumbled upon a river. *the river. Relief hit me like a wave. We followed it, running along the bank until we saw the boat in the distance. We had made it. As we climbed aboard, exhausted and shaking, I turned to look back at the jungle. And there, standing just at the tree line, was a figure. Not running, not hiding, just standing, watching. We never spoke about it after that. But I know what I saw, and I know we were never supposed to leave. I had planned this trip for months. A solo camping and hiking trip deep in the wilderness, away from people, away from the noise of life. I wanted quiet, peace, just me and nature. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but I had never gone this deep before. The area was remote, far from any major roads, and I had picked a spot miles from the nearest established campsite. It was supposed to be a test of my skills, a challenge. The drive out was long, over 2 hours on paved roads, then another hour on rough dirt roads before I finally parked my truck at a small clearing. From there, it was a 5-mile hike to where I planned to set up camp. A small clearing near a river far from anyone. I had mapped it out, studied the terrain, made sure there were no major hazards. Everything seemed perfect. The hike in was peaceful. The sun was out, and the air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees. I took my time, stopping every now and then to rest and take in the view. It was perfect, exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked some food. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the temperature dropped quickly. The sounds of the forest changed too. The birds went quiet, replaced by the occasional crack of branches in the distance, the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. It was peaceful, but I felt that familiar tension that always comes with being alone in the woods at night. I wasn't scared, just aware. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, listening to the distant sound of running water from the river. Everything was fine, normal. But then, somewhere out in the dark, I heard something. A sharp snap, a branch breaking. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, a single loud crack. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but otherwise, everything was silent. I stared into the darkness, trying to see past the flickering light. Nothing. I shook it off. Could have been anything. A tree settling, a branch finally giving in under its own weight. I wasn't about to get worked up over something so small. I forced myself to relax, finished my food, and crawled into my tent. The night passed without incident. I woke up early, stretched, and made some coffee over the fire. The unease from the night before was gone, replaced by the excitement of the day ahead. I had planned a long hike up to a ridge that overlooked the valley. It was about 7 miles there and back. Not an easy hike, but nothing I couldn't handle. I packed a small bag with food, water, a knife, and my GPS. I made sure to mark my campsite's location before heading out. The trail was tough, steep in some places and overgrown in others, but I made good progress. After a few hours, I reached the ridge and took in the view. The valley stretched out below, endless trees in every direction. No signs of people, no roads, no towns. Just pure wilderness. I ate my lunch, enjoyed the silence, and then started heading back. I was about halfway down when I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft dirt, and they were heading in the same direction as me, toward my campsite. My heart started pounding. I crouched down, studying them. They were big boot prints, and whoever left them had come this way recently. I looked around, scanning the trees. No one, no movement, just the whisper of the wind through the branches. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was another hiker, someone else out here enjoying the wilderness. But I knew that wasn't right. There were no other cars where I parked, no other trails leading out here. Whoever it was, they hadn't come from the road. They had been out here already. I picked up my pace, moving quickly but carefully. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some hunter passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I got closer to my campsite, my stomach twisted into knots. The footprints didn't stop. They kept going, straight to my tent. I crouched behind a tree, staring at my campsite from a distance. My tent was still there, my fire pit undisturbed. But something felt off. I scanned the area, heart pounding. Nothing moved. I waited for what felt like an eternity, watching, listening. Still nothing. Finally, I stepped out, moving slowly, carefully. The silence was overwhelming. I unzipped my tent and looked inside. Everything was as I left it. My sleeping bag, my gear untouched. I checked my food supply. Nothing missing. But then I noticed it. The firewood. I had left a neat pile stacked beside the fire pit. Now it was scattered. Not like an animal had gotten into it, but like someone had kicked through it, deliberately knocking it over. That was it. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, watching me. I grabbed my knife and stood still, listening. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. I packed up my essentials, GPS, flashlight, water, just in case. Then, just as I was about to make a decision, I heard it again. A branch snapping. Closer this time. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I knew someone was out there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I grabbed my pack and started walking, fast but not running. I had my GPS. I could make it back to my truck before dark if I moved quickly. I kept my knife in my hand the whole way. Every so often, I stopped to listen. More snapping branches. More rustling. Whoever it was, they were following me. I picked up the pace. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I was maybe a mile from my truck when I heard something that sent ice through my veins. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps. Coming from behind me. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The ground blurred beneath me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps pounded behind me, getting closer. Then silence. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing, but I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing through the burning in my legs, my chest. When I finally saw my truck, I almost collapsed from relief. I reached it, threw the door open, and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine. My headlights cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait. I peeled out of that clearing, dirt kicking up behind me. As I sped down the road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something chasing me. But the road stayed empty. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. I never found out who it was. I never went back. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the south of France. I'd been working non-stop for months, stuck in a routine that was slowly wearing me down. I needed the break, the kind where you get away from everything. No phone, no work emails, just the quiet of nature. I had always loved the outdoors, and I figured a few nights out in the wilderness would do me good. I chose a spot in the Pyrenees, a remote area far from any major roads or towns. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. The campsite I picked was deep in the forest, just near a small clearing with a stream running close by. It was perfect, far enough from the main trails to avoid other campers, but not so isolated that I couldn't find my way back. I parked my car at the closest access point, a dirt path that led into the woods, and hiked about 2 hours before setting up camp. By the time I got there, the sun was already dipping below the trees. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I set up my tent quickly, knowing that once night fell, it would be much harder to do anything. I gathered some firewood from around the clearing and got a small fire going. As I sat by the flames, I ate a quick meal, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling in the bushes, the distant hoot of an owl, the trickling of the stream. It was peaceful, exactly what I had come for, but something about the silence felt off. Too quiet even for the wilderness. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was just overthinking things. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and fed the fire a few more logs. It was then that I heard it, a snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness behind me. My entire body went still. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was deliberate, like the careful step of something or someone moving through the trees. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the treeline. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see anything beyond a few meters. I listened, heart pounding in my ears. Nothing, just the wind moving through the branches. Trying to shake off the unease, I told myself it was probably just a deer or a fox. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Animals didn't move like that, not so deliberately. I stayed by the fire for another hour, forcing myself to stay awake. But the exhaustion of the day started to take over. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The thin fabric didn't feel like much protection, but it was better than nothing. I lay there listening. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees, every distant sound made my mind race. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps moving through the leaves outside my tent. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there might hear it. I reached for the knife I always carried when camping, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could feel the weight of something shifting near the entrance of my tent. The fabric barely moved, but I knew something was there. I stayed completely still, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence outside backed away. Slow, careful steps retreating into the forest. I exhaled, barely realizing I had been holding my breath. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and at some point, I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I woke just before dawn, the first light of morning filtering through the fabric of my tent. I unzipped it carefully, stepping out into the cold morning air. The fire had burned down to embers, and the ground around my tent was undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading away from where I had heard the noises in the night. They weren't mine. I followed them a few meters into the woods before stopping. They led deeper, disappearing into the trees. I wasn't about to find out where they ended. Packing up my things as quickly as I could, I hiked back to my car without stopping. I didn't look back. I never went camping alone again. I don't know why I keep going back into the woods. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's just what I know. I grew up in the mountains in a family that spent more time outside than in, and as an adult, I never lost that. I work in an office, I live in a city, but every chance I get, I find myself driving out, leaving behind the buildings and the crowds. The forest always felt like home. It always felt safe. That changed in 2019. It was late September. The leaves were turning, and the air had just started to carry that crispness that lets you know summer is really over. It was the perfect time for a solo camping trip, the kind I'd taken dozens of times before. I had a usual spot deep in the woods, about 2 hours from my house, far enough from any roads that I wouldn't hear anything but the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. I had always felt comfortable out there. I knew how to handle myself, how to start a fire, how to keep my food sealed away from animals, how to tell when something wasn't right. But I wasn't prepared for this. The drive was familiar, and I barely thought about it as I turned down old logging roads, following the twists and turns I had memorized over years of trips. By the time I parked, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I grabbed my pack and started hiking, moving deeper into the forest, the sound of my own boots on the dirt the only thing breaking the quiet. I found my usual clearing with no trouble, a flat patch of earth surrounded by thick trees, just big enough for my tent and a fire pit. I set up quickly, working through the routine with muscle memory. Tent up, firewood gathered, food hung from a tree in case of bears. Everything felt normal. I cooked dinner over the fire, ate while listening to the distant sound of an owl somewhere in the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. Then, as I was cleaning up, something changed. The forest went silent. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know that silence isn't normal. Even at night, you can usually hear something: crickets, wind, the rustle of leaves. But suddenly, there was nothing. I sat there, still, my hands frozen around my tin cup. The only sound was the crackling of my fire. I listened, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just that unnatural, heavy silence. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the leaves just beyond the firelight. I held my breath. I knew there were animals out here, deer, maybe a coyote, but something about the way those steps fell, the heavy, measured rhythm, made my skin crawl. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering edge of the firelight. I stood up. The steps stopped. For a long moment, I didn't move. Neither did whatever was out there. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, the sound started again. Closer this time. Something was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam through the trees. Nothing. Just branches, leaves, the empty forest. I exhaled slowly. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it had been a deer, startled by the light. I sat back down, but the feeling didn't go away. The silence still hung heavy in the air. My skin prickled. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, but I forced myself to shake it off. I wasn't new to this. I had camped alone dozens of times. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tight. I lay there, listening, straining to hear past the quiet. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was still dark, and I wasn't alone. I knew it before I even opened my eyes. That feeling, that deep, instinctive sense of being watched, pressed down on me like a weight. I turned my head, heart pounding, and listened. There was something just outside my tent. Not an animal, not a bear or a coyote sniffing around. Something else. The footsteps were slow, careful, circling. Then a sound, a whisper. Not words, just a low, rasping murmur, like something trying to speak but not quite forming the sounds. I went cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The whispering stopped, and then something pressed against the tent wall. A shape. I couldn't see it clearly, just the way the fabric pushed inward, the shadowy outline of something leaning in. It wasn't a hand. It wasn't a paw. It was something in between. Too long, too thin. The shape of it was wrong, the way it moved unnatural. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. If I moved, it would hear me. I forced myself to stay still, my hands clenched into fists. The shape lingered, and then, just as slowly, it pulled away. The footsteps retreated. I lay there for what felt like hours, frozen, waiting, listening. Finally, the forest sounds returned. A distant rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl. I stayed in my tent until the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I broke camp, packed everything as fast as I could, barely taking the time to fold my tent before stuffing it into my pack. I didn't look around. I didn't try to check for footprints. I just left. I hiked back to my car without stopping, my skin crawling the entire way. Every step I took, I felt like I was being watched. I made it home, locked my door, told myself I had imagined it. But I know I didn't, because a week later, I was scrolling through my phone, looking at the pictures I had taken on my trip, and in one of them, just at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, there was something standing between the trees, something that looked almost human, but not quite, and it was watching me. I never liked camping alone, but I did it anyway. I told myself it was for the peace, the quiet, the break from city life. The truth was, I wanted to prove to myself that I could, that I wasn't scared of being in the middle of nowhere with nothing but my own two hands to rely on. It was late autumn, and I had taken a week off work to drive up to a secluded camping spot in the mountains. I wasn't going to a national park or some designated campsite with marked trails and friendly rangers. No, I wanted real solitude. I had found a stretch of wilderness a few hours' drive from town, barely mentioned in any guidebooks, just an old logging road that led to the edge of a vast, untouched forest. The drive was rough. The road was barely more than a dirt path, overgrown in places and scattered with deep potholes from years of neglect. The last few miles were the worst. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and at one point, I thought I had gotten stuck in the mud. I should have taken that as a sign to turn back. I didn't. By the time I found a clearing big enough to park and set up camp, the sun was already getting low. The trees stretched high all around me, their tops swaying gently in the wind, making a sound like distant whispers. I didn't see any footprints or signs that anyone had been here recently. That was good. That was what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire before the last light faded from the sky. I ate a simple meal, canned soup heated over the flames, then sat back in my camp chair, listening to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. Leaves rustled. A few crickets chirped. It was peaceful. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had been lying in my sleeping bag, struggling to fall asleep. The ground was hard, the forest was too quiet, and my mind kept running through all the things that could go wrong. That was when I heard it. Something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just a rabbit or some small animal rustling through the leaves. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. I froze. My first thought was a bear. But bears didn't usually walk that way, and they didn't stop and stand still like whatever this was doing. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had just been my own breathing, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I rolled onto my side, closed my eyes. The moment I did, the footsteps started again. This time, they circled my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I wanted to reach for my flashlight, my knife, anything, but I was too afraid. I listened as the steps moved slowly around my tent, the dry leaves crunching softly underfoot. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I waited. Nothing. I don't know how long I stayed awake, staring at the fabric of my tent, too scared to even move. But eventually, exhaustion won. I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I crawled out of my tent, stiff and sore from a night of bad sleep. The forest looked the same as it had the day before. Peaceful, normal, except for one thing. There were footprints in the dirt around my tent. Not animal tracks, not mine.
Bare footprints.
They were fresh, deep, clear, and they were everywhere. My stomach tightened. I looked around, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one. I told myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe I had left my tent at some point during the night, half asleep, and just didn't remember. It didn't make sense, but I needed it to. The alternative was worse. I spent the day trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I went for a long walk, trying to find a better camping spot, but everything felt wrong. The trees seemed too close together. The silence felt heavier. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the forest itself was watching me. When I got back to camp, I decided I'd had enough. I would pack up first thing in the morning and leave. That night, I barely slept. And then the worst thing happened. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. Breathing. It was right outside my tent. Not the wind, not an animal. Human breathing. Slow, steady. I didn't move, didn't blink. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in a part of the forest where no one went. The breathing continued. Then I heard something even worse. The zipper of my tent. It moved, a few inches, then stopped. I clutched my knife in my hand, heart pounding. The zipper moved again. Whoever it was, they were trying to get inside. I didn't think. I acted. I lunged forward, slamming my hand against the tent wall, screaming as loud as I could. The breathing stopped. For a second, everything was still. Then running. Heavy footsteps, crashing through the undergrowth, fading into the distance. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I unzipped my tent and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing, but the footprints were there, fresh, deep, leading away from my tent, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire with my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed my gear in record time and got the hell out of there. The drive back was nerve-wracking. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure standing there. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. When I finally got home, I locked every door, every window. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, but I know this: I was not alone, and I will never go camping alone again. I had been planning the trip for weeks. Work had been stressful and I just needed a break. Time to be alone, away from emails, away from people, away from everything. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my old bolt-action rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but it was more for peace of mind. I always carried a firearm when camping alone. The plan was simple: drive up into the mountains, find a quiet spot deep in the woods, and just relax for a few days. No phones, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I had done trips like this before, but this time I wanted to go further off the beaten path. The drive was long, nearly 5 hours, and the last stretch was nothing but dirt roads winding through dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. That was exactly what I wanted. I finally found a spot that seemed perfect. It was a small clearing just big enough for my tent and a fire pit. The nearest hiking trail was miles away, which meant I wouldn't be running into anyone. I set up camp, pitched my tent, and gathered some firewood. The silence was almost eerie. No distant traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the wind moving through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned food over the fire, listened to the distant sound of an owl, and then went to sleep early. The forest was peaceful and I felt safe. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I hiked for a few hours, found a small stream where I refilled my water bottles, and just enjoyed the quiet. It was exactly what I needed. But that afternoon, I noticed something strange. As I was heading back to camp, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I had been walking in soft ground, and my own tracks were easy to spot. But these prints were fresh, and they weren't there earlier when I passed through. They were boot prints larger than mine. Someone had been walking near my camp. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through. But I hadn't heard any gunshots, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was hours away, and I hadn't seen another car on the road since I left the highway. Back at camp, everything seemed untouched. My tent was still zipped. My gear was where I left it. I checked around but found nothing else unusual. That night, I kept my rifle close. I wasn't scared, just cautious. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But something didn't sit right with me. Around midnight, I woke up. Something had snapped a branch outside my tent. It was close. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow through the fabric of the tent. I strained my ears, but the woods had gone silent. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around my camp. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, slow breaths. I reached for my rifle, moving as quietly as I could. My hand closed around the stock and I waited. Then the footsteps moved away, slow at first, then fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I was just paranoid. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw them. Footprints circling my campsite. Someone had been there. I packed up fast. Whatever was happening, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't taking any chances. As I was loading my gear into my truck, I noticed something. In the dirt, near the tree line, was something small and shiny. I walked over and picked it up. It was a button, a black button torn from a jacket. It looked old, weathered, but it hadn't been there yesterday. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing. I got in my truck and started driving. The road was rough, winding through miles of forest. My hands were tight on the wheel, my eyes flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step onto the road behind me. I didn't relax until I was back on pavement, back in civilization. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again.